came together in March with the aim to fulfill what we believe is our social and democratic responsibility in the current situation. What we aim to do is offer analysis of the situation through scientific methods as well in March with the aim to fulfill what we believe is our social and democratic responsibility in the current situation. What we aim to do is offer analysis of the situation through scientific methods as well in March. Right, to put people on mute. Okay. Social and democratic responsibility in the current situation. What we aim to do is offer analysis of the situation. So again, I just request all participants on Zoom to make sure that your audio as well as video is off, otherwise it sort of will keep interrupting our session today. So we came together with the aim of analyzing the situation through scientific methods, as well as with the aim of reaching out to the public with the latest scientific evidence. What I'll do now is share my screen so I can just show you our website. Okay, so hopefully you are able to see the website here. So this is the IndSciCOVID.in, which is our website, and you can see here that we have different sections. So like in line with our aims, the first section you can see is for public. Over here we have sections on busting hoaxes related to COVID-19, a Q&A section, daily life and COVID-19. In this, we have sections on mental health. Just pull up, where we try and create awareness as well as offer some basic resources and strategies around issues that we think are pertinent at this time around mental health. You can also see that we have sections on maintaining hygiene and other aspects that we think are important to address. What we also want to point out here is that all of these resources are available in a number of different languages through infographics as well as material online. For scientists and healthcare professionals, we also have various other teams that are working on different aspects. I want to just highlight the IndSciCOVID team here. That includes epidemiologists who are, as mentioned here, offering models which are the first sort of detailed, state-specific epidemiological compartmental models for COVID-19 in India. So you can really get a sense of the data through different areas. And we have a graph here can kind of highlight what we mean. We also now have a section on YouTube on life after lockdown, since we are entering sort of the next phase. So yeah, I hope that you will find some of these resources helpful. I also just want to mention that for our audience here, if anybody is interested, you can please sort of reach out to us and join us in our efforts to translate content to different languages. If that's something that is appealing to you, we do request that you can either email us or reach out via any social media channels, all mentioned on our homepage. And I think with that, I will move on to our session today. So today, as you know, we will be discussing challenges to mental health during the pandemic, and we will hear about the latest research on causes of mental illness from Dr. Sanjeev Jain, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at NIMHANS, Bangalore. A brief introduction about Dr. Jain. So Dr. Jain heads the molecular genetics lab at NIMHANS that provides genetic testing as well as counseling services. He has over 200 papers on genetic factors of mental illness and on history of mental health services in India. Apart from academic research, he also has a book on psychological impact of partition in India. We're all thrilled to have Dr. Jain here to talk to us about something that we think is really important at this point. Just in terms of format, we will begin with a presentation by Dr. Jain. This will be for around 20-25 minutes, followed by questions from the audience. So you can type in your questions in the Zoom chat window, and those watching live on Facebook or YouTube, you can also type in your questions there. We'll try and take as many as possible. May I again sort of request that you just keep your audio and video off through the session so there are no interruptions. And Dr. Jain, if you can hear me, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Avantika, for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and let's see what I can share with you about all this. So, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah.
Yes.
So, I'll be spending the next 15, 20, 22 minutes on some aspects of psychiatric issues linked to COVID. This will be broadly following this kind of flow: the direct effects of the virus, the psychiatric aspects of the illness syndrome itself, of the COVID-19 illness syndrome, the capitals of disease, morbidity, and illness, and the psychological response to the illness, as is expected to be seen or is being seen, the social responses to the pandemic and psychiatric consequences, and a larger issue of healthcare services and the various roles that these systems may have in both answering the current issues of the pandemic response and the long-term services that we need to put in place. Now, since it's a group of scientists, we all know that it's a well-known family of viruses which has been around for a very, very long time. It has been implicated in similar infections over the last 2 decades, SARS and MERS. And in 2018, actually, Professor Gloria from AIIMS had written a review article in the Indian Journal of Medical Research commemorating 100 years of the previous flu epidemic and warning that similar epidemics are likely to occur, in a fairly recurrent manner, and that we should be prepared. So this is rather prescient in 2018 to have a review article like that. We all know that it's a zoonotic infection, that gives rise to certain peculiarities in this whole thing. We have been talking a lot about commensal microbiomes and gut microbiome, but perhaps it's also important to understand that there are commensal biomes in vertebrates, which can occasionally mutate to pathogenic strains, and which is why these are zoonotic infections. And surprisingly, they're usually not toxic to the primary host species, but in the secondary host. So the whole mutational biases and tensions which drive these mutations are still not known. And so we really have no idea why the mutations have arisen in that sense, which are highly toxic. We don't know the selection pressures. We don't know the environmental circumstances by which this particular mutation crossed a vertebrate species. So this is something that we do need to understand. We already know that it binds to ACE2 receptors, which is a long protein, transmembrane protein. It then invaginates, replicates, and spreads from cell to cell and through the extracellular fluid, wherever the fluid goes. So it's a fairly rapid kind of infection. It takes 4 or 5 days for this to accumulate enough numbers in the body. But the fact that it binds to ACE2 receptors gives rise to certain peculiarities. We know that many aspects of our sensory system is governed by so-called G protein coupled receptors, such as taste and smell, and transmembrane proteins have motives which allow them to cross membranes. So one of the things that we've been worrying about is that whether there's a component within the binding site of the COVID virus, which also binds to the GPCRs that mediate taste and smell, and which is why the loss of taste or smell is a primary effect on the taste and smell receptors in the mouth itself. That also gives rise to the secondary possibility, because the virus replicates first in the oropharyngeal mucosa. And even in the epidemic of 1890s in India, a very enthusiastic pathologist in Calcutta had actually done biopsies, autopsies and biopsies of people who died of the influenza virus of 1896, and found out that that so-called inflammatory signs are maximum and deep inside the recesses of these sinuses of the face, and therefore the fact that these are niches in which the virus multiplies in the oropharynx is very interesting. And that, of course, gives rise to the possibility that it spreads through the olfactory epithelium directly into the brain. As you can see, the olfactory epithelium is at the roof of the nasopharynx. And because the virus can bind to these receptor proteins, which are there in almost all mucosal surfaces, including, for example, the bronchial musculature, the bronchial linings, which is why the ACE2 inhibition gives rise to such massive fluid imbalances. But it can also bind and get incorporated into the olfactory epithelium. And the effects on the brain are multiple. It can cause, because of its effect on the blood system, it can cause blood clots and strokes, and we'll be talking about that in a bit more detail. It can also cause an arthritis and various kinds of direct effects on the brain. But so the illness obviously has many parameters. Some of the brain effects are just one component of the whole biology. But I presume one is already aware of the respiratory, cardiac, and the other biology by now, well aware of that. What is the evidence that there is a direct effect on the brain? Almost a third of all patients, and these are series both from France and from Wuhan itself, the initial symptoms are very often headache, giddiness, and almost a third of the patients have direct neurological symptoms like encephalopathy, agitation and confusion, or an acute hemorrhagic necrosis, because the endothelial responses of the microvasculature in the brain, which are basically controlled by the ACE2 receptors, give rise to local abnormalities in the brain. So these kinds of hemorrhagic damage to the brain will obviously give rise to severe behavioral effects. We do not have any evidence whether this is accompanied by an actual evidence of viremia in the brain. I have not been able to get any study which have directly studied CSF samples from patients with COVID-19, and whether we know that the antigenic response, that there are certain proteins which are detectable in CSF, but what is the magnitude of the actual viral duplication or replication in the CSF? We don't seem to have a very good idea. Many aspects of the COVID-19 will produce neurological or neuropsychiatric effects. One, of course, is the vascular effects, which I've just alluded to. Second, of course, is hypoxia. So because when the lungs are inflamed, there's a profound fall in oxygen carrying capacity. And also with the ventilation, the kind of ventilation that is provided can produce hypoxia or hypercapnia. And both these things can be quite damaging to the CNS function. So regulating respiration, both in the ICU and otherwise, creates problems. The immune dysfunctions are quite widespread, as we all know, causing all these cytokine storms. But as part of the inflammation, the blood-brain barrier can get altered, and some of these inflammatory responses proteins can leak into the brain, and they in turn will cause certain kinds of pictures such as encephalitis. But there may be a primary ACE2 linked biology itself in the brain. Like I alluded to, this can affect a large number of proteins. And a kind of modeling study by Ganpati Raju et al. From the US looked at all the possible interactomes with the consequent to the binding of the ACE2 receptor and its dysfunction, and the number of cellular processes that could get affected. There may be other brain-specific processes which we really do not understand very well, except in generic terms, because the brain's immune system is very different from the rest of the body's immune system. And it has a much different manner of the memory of the immune system. So what will be the long-term effects of this immune system being activated by this pathogen? We really need to understand. We still need to understand a bit better. So the psychiatric aspects of the illness syndrome per se, as I mentioned, dizziness, headaches, somatic symptoms, just like a flu, are quite common. Now we all know that of all the common viral infections, flu symptoms have a very high rate of so-called depressive symptoms of fatigue, body ache, general feeling of malaise. So all those things can come up. And we really don't understand why flu is almost always accompanied by mood symptoms, but it is. And we don't know the biology of that very well. The more severe presentations like mania, schizophrenia, catatonia have been seen in case reports, but no definite impression of increased risk has been observed as yet. I mean, this is part of the wider confusion, disorientation, etc., etc. Encephalopathies have been well described by now, so that there is almost like a Japanese encephalitis kind of picture, which means that they can have gross tremors and then ultimately fits, and then lapse into prolonged delirium states. Now, whether this will result in microcephaly like the Zika virus in future children, we have yet to understand. And they can be demyelinating and degenerative disorders, as with other viral infections. So post-viral infection like a Guillain-Barré syndrome, there can be acute demyelination of many parts of the nervous system. But and these kinds of symptoms have been reported, but we don't have an accurate number of which kinds of syndromes have presented. Most of this is based upon groups of patients seen either in Wuhan or in San Francisco, New York, Paris. And these reports are coming up at the rate of almost several a day. Of course, the COVID virus infection may be a trigger for many other autoimmune disorders, and some of these antibodies have been co-localized in patients who earlier have been diagnosed to have multiple sclerosis or even schizophrenia. So whether this will cause or will this be intimately linked with the future occurrence of autoimmune disorders which present as neuropsychiatric disorders, we do need to understand that also a bit better. The secondary to neuroinflammation, as I mentioned earlier, because of the breach in the blood-brain barrier and exposure to the cytokine storms, the widespread patterns of brain dysfunction like seen with Zika and Japanese encephalitis, which is endemic in northern India, for example, and in parts of southern India, can also be seen. The long-term effects are very critical. We really need to understand that a bit better, and I'll be talking about that in a little while. There is some evidence, for example, that things like ApoE4, which is a risk factor for dementia, offer some resistance to hepatitis C virus and viremias when one is young. So the presence of certain alleles which are involved in neurodegenerative disease may be selected for in survival from viral illnesses at a young age, but may add on to risk of neurodegenerative disease as one grows older. There is some preliminary evidence that elderly people who already have an ApoE4 allele and have dementia, etc., seem to be at higher risk of death following COVID-19. So there may be a complex relationship between genotypes, dementias, and neurodegenerative disorders. And this is something we would need to understand. Now, as far as the disease, morbidity, and illness, or the psychological response to illness is concerned, I work in a big mental hospital, and we've been very successful in not having even one single positive case in our 400 odd inpatients at this point of time. So I can't claim any personal knowledge of this. But even otherwise, there has not been many studies from institutional facilities or from those who handle chronic mental illness as to what the effect of COVID virus has been on people who already have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Of course, the dementia and the care home mortality in the West has been a very sobering experience, because these are people who probably had some kind of neuropsychiatric disorders, were in long stay facilities, and have had high rates of mortality and morbidity. At NIMHANS, my colleagues, Professor Reddy et al., did a small study. Now, many of you would have heard of a disease called obsessive compulsive disorder, which makes people fear contamination and wash hands repeatedly and be very super clean or super organized in the way they handle their personal hygiene. The query was that would people who are unnaturally worried about personal hygiene, how would they react to this episode when everybody is increasing their sense of sanitation and there is a overwhelming social imperative to wash hands repeatedly. Surprisingly, there was no increase in the level of anxiety or in contamination fears or by washing hands in patients who already had OCD. This gives rise to the old truism that the mentally ill actually live in a kind of double bookkeeping space. They are able to isolate their symptoms from real life. And since this is a real life issue, it doesn't really interfere with their illness as such. Many of them, of course, reported somewhat a feeling of increased relaxation because now they felt everybody was washing their hands, so they didn't feel left out as they were earlier. This is an interesting little study on about 200 people. Now, the understandable psychological response to illness is, of course, very dramatic. There is understandable increase in fear and anxiety. There have been large number of suicides, both because of the threat of perceived infection or threat to the social body. That means the threat of quarantine or being separated from your loved ones or being unable to reach your loved ones. So this threat, not just to your own physical body, but to your whole social body, can drive people to suicide. The inequalities of society and the othering of the virus and of the people who are infected gives rise to even greater amounts of fear and anxiety, so that people who have been diagnosed, who think they have the illness, are then stigmatized by others. These go back to very old theories in psychology and psychiatry. Freud himself had talked of the death instinct of Thanatos as being equally valid as the libidinal instinct or the procreative instinct. Existentialism has always talked about the notion of ultimate threat of when the being itself is threatened and what kind of trauma that causes in your existential sense of self itself. And these go back to millennia, to a recorded cultural history from Buddha, Christ, and all Indian civilizations. The fear of death is one of the most profound causes of anxiety. In biblical terms, again, plagues, locusts, storms, and earthquakes are often seen as divine punishments, and we in India have been lucky to have all four of them in the last 4 days. So whether we are getting a divine punishment for our sins, we really have no idea, but it's quite likely, I think. The more troublesome cost, of course, is the social stigma and isolation due to illness. Now, this gives rise to a large amount of feeling of exclusion and othering. And from our previous work on the so-called partition-related trauma, this kind of being a permanent outsider will give rise to various other forms of psychiatric problems. In the midst of all this, one should not forget that the psychological aspects of ICU care, of enforced quarantine and social withdrawal itself are pretty damaging. And of course, a large number of ICU psychosis or ICU deliriums have also been seen, especially when you can't even see the face of the doctor because they're all behind masks. So people make all kinds of efforts to make sure that the stimulus level in the ICU and the kind of human face-to-face contact, despite all the plexiglass, is maintained. The long-term consequences for psychiatry have also been debated for a long time. The epidemic of 1918 was followed soon by the encephalitis lethargica epidemic of 1922, which caused a peak in the occurrence of schizophrenia. Those of you who've seen a movie called Awakening will remember Robert De Niro, who comes out of coma for 50 years once the levodopa is given to him. So whether the encephalitis lethargica was a variant of the influenza infection, we didn't have virology in those days, so we have no idea. But the two illnesses occurred almost simultaneously. And over the last few decades, there has always been this interest that in utero exposure to influenza or in exposure of these viruses in a very early life actually increases the risk of schizophrenia as you grow older. So this has been in Edinburgh and by long-term studies of the epidemic in New York and London. So these kinds of issues have been debated for some time, but of course the data is quite contradictory. It relies entirely on historical data, and we have not had these kinds of widespread pandemics for us to actually test this out in the real world, which this illness may afford an opportunity for. So the fact that these viruses alter, because of the neuroinflammation, patterns of development in the human brain in a way like Zika does, very obviously in causing microcephaly, these cause very subtle changes in brain networks, which over time increase risk for schizophrenia. So the very, very long term, the 10 or 20-year outcome of this influenza virus will also need to be studied. The social responses and the social psychological responses are equally critical. We know that quarantine and social isolation are inherently an anathema to Homo sapiens. We have become successful because of our herd mentality, because we work in groups, we live in groups, and these groups are essential to psychological well-being. And they go almost hand in hand with so-called herd immunity. So the two concepts of the mentality and the immunity are actually linked to each other, which is why, for example, when viruses were introduced to isolated communities during the phase of colonization, entire communities were wiped out in Andamans, in North America, and South America, because the immunity levels of those herds were very different from the immunity levels in the rest of the colonizers. So the two concepts are linked together. But in a more fundamental sense, in response to stress or danger like infection does, affiliation and physical contact seeking are core responses of our so-called brains. Social distancing by itself is unnatural. We at best maintain a meter distance when talking to friends and acquaintances to create and maintain social bonds, and often it's much closer. To insist on a 2-meter distance towards all social contact, therefore, is very, very unnatural for human beings. And contact seeking is actually a very natural drive. In animals, in many primate studies, the urge for social contact is almost as strong as that for hunger and water. So it's a natural drive. And renouncing social contact is therefore a major deviation from the way our brain and our society and our ecology works. And we have to ensure, as this essay by Frith and others points out in a recent publication, that self-isolation, quarantine, lockdown, and distancing will indiscriminately trigger feelings of loss, which can only be countered by making sure that we are socially supportive and cooperative in face of this collective menace. Now, coming towards the end, what does it mean for the healthcare services per se? Now, planning for a unified response to epidemics and crises was attempted several times during colonial rule. As you can see in the little box on the right-hand side, the colonial period was marked by severe famines and epidemics, which would diminish the population by several tens of lakhs every time. As you can see, famine, malaria, cholera, plague, all these things occurred at fairly systematic levels during the period when the British were directly in control, between 1850 to 1950, which is when these records were made. Now, after 1918, we have not had such widespread influenza pandemics, except for cholera, which went on till almost to 1980. But all these things guided what was so-called the Bore Committee, the Health Reforms Committee, which suggested a unified pattern of National Health Service for India post-independence. This was set up sometime in 1942-43, at the same time as the NHS was being planned in UK. And the idea was that after independence, India would develop its own NHS, a blueprint of which was made available in this Bore Committee, which was advised by international experts from all over the world. However, on the ground, the Indian Medical Service itself was disbanded after independence. Unlike the army, the judiciary, or the civil service, and the judiciary service, which were all continued after independence, the medical service was the one specific pan-Indian service which was disbanded. And the idea of a national health service was very quickly buried by a number of economic and administrative reasons. There was no money, India was too poor, rupee was devalued. There was a lot of, anyway, health was a state subject since the British had made it that in 1880, and we like to obey the British and everything. So all these systems made the national health response very compromised. So coordinated systematic response to a pandemic was severely compromised. Just to put a historical perspective, this is the Indian Medical Gazette of 1918. As you can see, it starts with Bombay in 1918, And the amount of debility and old age factors, other general disease and nervous parameters are linked to very high rates, to much higher rates of the illness. As you can see, the nervous temperament and the old age high risk is the average death rates in the elderly, and this is the peak produced in that period in those who are already debilitated or elderly. So it caused a massive death rate. In the first layer of in the first wave of the epidemic, it spread quite rapidly. But the so-called untouchable caste were not affected because, as Phipson pointed out, the fact that they were untouchable protected them from contagion. And for the first 2 months, their death rates were low. But over 2 years, when it became more widespread, you can see the whole issue of class and caste which comes in. So Europeans have the lowest death rates, and as you can see, it climbs gradually towards the lower end of the spectrum. And the low caste Hindus had a death rate which was 3 times higher than the others. So the issues of access to healthcare, the way it is spread, the way it was managed, has repercussions even now. When you find that the poorest are the ones who have the highest mortality rate, it's worldwide, whether it's in England or whether it's in America or in India, there will be an issue like this. And as the author pointed out, the public health conscience is a plant of very tender growth in India. Although it must be acknowledged that never before in the history of India, the educated and the more fortunately placed have come forward in such large numbers, as hopefully we all have, to help their poorer brethren. The impact of this on social factors was very widespread. As you can see in this map, the virus came to Bombay, which is the highest rate even now. It spread along the major railway tracks to the central provinces, through the central provinces and to UP and upwards all the way to Afghanistan. So these are the predominant railway tracks of British India, and it spread right along the railway tracks. And so migrations were identified, and most of this was caused by villagers, by workers fleeing the city to avoid the epidemic or to get back home. Exactly the same causes as are being implicated now. So the fact that we knew this from 100 years ago and is quite well known. It had a huge impact, as you can see, even on things like on birth cohorts. So the people who were born in this time continued, or in successive years, continued to have effects on their height and weight and etc. etc. So a number of parameters have been assessed by various investigators to assess the long-term impact of this. In India, around 11 million people died, and it is the only decade in the 20th century that did not have a population growth. And of course, there have been other indicators to suggest that the death of 11 million people actually increased the wealth of the survivors. So India then entered a phase of economic growth and did not suffer in the depression as much as other parts of the world did. But that's a purely economic aspect of this. So in this, I'll be ending up with just one more slide, that in the future, let us hope the lessons of 1918, so hardly learned, will not be easily forgotten because of what happened about 100 years ago. Why is it that worries us, and worries me at least? This article we are just, which is to appear in the Indian Journal of Social Psychiatry, the worry is that the penetration of science and medicine, both as a social imperative and a public good, and a public common, has not been encouraged. So the participation of the public in these scientific debates about the nature of the virus, how it replicates, how it spreads, it's not participative, it is prescriptive. So people are told not to wash their hands, but it's somehow assumed that they are too simple or too stupid to really understand why this is being said. So this kind of an ivory tower or a navel-gazing elite scientist activity of data crunching, of understanding molecular biology, is blind to the real needs of the people. And we don't really seem to understand that the virus is actually much simpler to understand than the various several issues that we deal with in social factors of illness. It is much easier to understand a virus than it is to understand classic inequalities or caste inequalities. To summarize, therefore, we know that the virus can lead to neurological alteration directly. It can worsen pre-existing neurological conditions and increase susceptibility or aggravate damage caused by other insults. So the need would be to study people who have been infected, people who have been carriers, people who have tested positive and recovered for the short term, to follow them up for the next 5, 10, 15 years, to really understand what the impact on the brain and the mind has been. We do need to understand that, and this is a kind of a polemical thing that is again part of another article, that our web of human beings, our social and emotional web, is ever complex and ever evolving, and a virus should not be able to regress our existence to a short, selfish, brutal Hobbesian parameter. And if the virus is contagious, so is hope. And we hope that this whole effort to actually combat the virus in its biological and social consequences will hopefully make us a better society and a better healthcare at least. Thank you. Well, that's, I think, the end of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jain, for your very insightful presentation. I really appreciate it. I'm sure our audience did as well. The way you talked about the intersections of biology and social factors, and that's something that often gets left behind. We do have questions that have come in, some prior to the session and some during. So let me begin with these. Our first set of question actually pertains to this intersection that you've been sort of talking about. Somebody has asked about the relative importance of heredity and nurture in determining an adult's ability to cope with stress, and specifically in cases of mental illness, just in terms of your perspective.
So we don't really have any accurate data on that. So that's the whole issue. So we do know that the previous epidemics increased rates of mental illness. Whether increased rates of mental illness in families or in children of people who already had a risk for mental illness, we have no idea. So we really don't. I really can't answer that question in any more accuracy. Over the interface between viral effects on people who are at genetic risk, I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that.
Right. And I think kind of related to this, somebody has also asked about, what research tells us about transgenerational nature of trauma in terms of how we expect this to play out in the future, especially with mass displacement going on currently.
Well, that is going to be a real troublesome issue, because if you look at most of the literature comes from on this kind of thing comes from the European experience, where the migrations of the Second World War are being followed up now for 3 generations: the Holocaust and the survivors and the grandchildren of the Holocaust, and their rates of psychiatric illness. Those kinds of things have not been attempted in non-European settings, Asia, Africa, which has also seen these kinds of mass migrations and mass displacements. Now, it could be that we are insensitive to these psychological traumas because our lives are short, brutish, and traumatic in any case. But over time, these do accumulate. A sense of social belongingness, or a sense of a larger ideal. For example, migrant workers who contributed to the birth and creation of a city are now told that they are outsiders. India, which was supposed to be one, now seems to be divided into every state calling back its own people by paying their own money and running their own buses. So where is the question of a shared notion of civic existence? So this kind of sundering of a sense of cohesiveness is likely to have very troublesome relapse into parochialism, and which will in turn have huge impacts on mental health. So this is going to be, it is going to be a transgenerational, transmission of these ideas, which is quite troublesome.
Yeah, and you sort of mentioned this. The other question that I think was related to this is someone asked about suggestions for addressing mental health of migrant workers currently, and if you know of any specific steps that have been taken in this regard with this population specifically.
Well, my colleagues are running a kind of a counseling service for the migrants who are uh, inverted commas trapped here.
Mm-hmm.
We have not had any formal report from what are the kinds of symptoms they are expressing. We have not had any formal documentation on the kind of psychological distress, except, of course, the fact that they have high rates of suicide and they are obviously in distress is a qualitative assumption that we all know. But I'm not aware of any systematic study on just this. We are the only country in the world which has seen this kind of migration, of enforced migration. No other countries which have produced lockdown have resulted in this kind of migration because of our insistence that you are essentially a unit and you and your family have to look after yourself. So everybody's been forced to go back to their families and homes. So we I really don't know what the level of distress in core psychiatric terms is. We do know that large number of distress. We can gauge that from the phone calls and the because lots of patients have been affected by this because a lot of our patients are from the working class migrant population, and as they migrate they want to know how will they get their drugs, who will look after their mentally ill person on the way, how will they find another psychiatrist in a new city. So all these issues have been really distressing to them.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the images that you put forth from the 1918 sort of data that we have. And I have a question here on based on our learnings from 1918 data and how the migrating workers spread the virus to the interiors. What can you suggest the government can do to involve communities from the grassroots up to lessen stigma and discrimination that is going to
So
come in the coming
yeah,
years?
so one of the suggestions of the 1918 inquiry report, which published in 1921-23, was that make sure that hospitals that care for the poorest is of as higher quality as for everybody else. So make sure that they will be looked after, assure them that help will be available. Because the major thing that is frightening them is that if they fall ill, they will not have the resources or the facilities will not be available for them to look after them in their illness.
Mm-hmm.
And so the report was particularly appreciative of the way the citizens of Bombay had stepped forward and organized these help. The hospitals had stepped in. The better, the fear of people from entering hospitals was mitigated by public, education and by outreach programs. So all these things were done, and basically there's this fear of the hospital and of medical services in general has to be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that time, immunization was not anywhere in the scenario, but at the ground level, I think the the effective transmission of this kind of information that the illness is rather overwhelmingly mild, that the vast majority have minor infections. It is not a, it is not an illness of biblical proportions that you really will be killed and die. So it is so that message of this being a catastrophic illness has somehow become almost a mythology, which is not actually understandable by in any scientific term. So I think one of the major things would be to reduce this kind of fear mongering and make it just a routine kind of medical thing and assure people that help will be available in case you do fall ill. And that I think is the bigger fear of the people.
And
I
then
don't think words and slogans would help. I think ensuring that healthcare is available at every district level is what would really help.
and I think this also speaks to sort of how mental health concerns intersect with so many other domains
Yes,
in making sure.
yes.
I'm just shifting gears a bit because I can see a few questions coming in on the impact of the current situation on youth and students, and the impact in both, some ideas you might have for tips on how to manage things such as student anxiety, depression in youth, students who are in their final years have unpredictable futures because of delayed results, cancellation of visas, all of the people are concerned with.
Those are really the great unknowns. Those are really, really the great unknowns. Because
What impact and what suggestions you might have to
yeah,
address.
because somebody who was a principal of a school was talking to me earlier in the morning, and they were having to balance this very difficult thing between some parents who are very paranoid about sending their school, other parents who want their children because they're losing out on school and they're losing out 6 months of education. And they think the 6 months of no schooling will cause a greater damage to the brain than whatever the virus can do. So it really is very difficult. Like I said, childhood is a time for social exploration and social bonding and learning long-term adaptive behaviors. Denying children and the young those kinds of opportunities to actually interact, intersect, learn new things for such a long time and be preoccupied with the fear of death is a very, very unnatural existence. So somewhere along the line, we would have to either managerially or professionally have to ratchet down the anxiety and the fears significantly. Of course, we do understand it's a severe illness, that it is something which can be pretty lethal, but a reasonable understanding, a rational behavior, understanding the science and the technology can actually reduce it to a very, very large extent. So I think that message, as far as the coping itself is concerned, I don't think a person at my age needs to advise the youth, because I think their brains are much better in discovering new ways to do things. So I'm sure there are much more inventive ways to establish contact. The commentator, Professor Frith, who's a neuropsychologist who works on MRI imaging and social neuroscience, had sitting in his so-called ivory tower in London, his major thing was make internet free and broadband for every human being on earth. Make sure that the virtual world is as real and as socially enriching and as socially empowering as real life interactions. Because the urge to be close to others is a much bigger need. And if you can't do that because of the fear of social closeness may give rise to infection, make sure you substitute that by technology-enabled social cohesion. But that is the most important thing, that no matter what you do with studies or play or social behavior, make sure your social interactions are well maintained, because that is actually the only real buffer for psychological distress.
And that's such an interesting point, because I know parents tend to be very concerned about social media use currently.
Yes. Yes.
Sounds like you're also saying that maybe it's time to reevaluate some of that concern at this particular point and allow you to connect in the ways that feels important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Then we have two questions that are sort of related in terms of if there's any clinical evidence of antipsychotic drugs or antidepressants inducing any sort of compromise in the patient's immunity towards the virus. Do you have any understanding of that?
See, that's a complex issue. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, many of the drugs that we use in psychiatry bind to membranes much the way the virus does. They bind to receptors, dopamine receptors or serotonin receptors. They get taken in by those cells, especially brain cells. They get recycled. So in many ways, they can be intersects where the antipsychotics may have some effect on viral biology. It may even be protective. There are groups in France which are trying out the work on using chlorpromazine, a traditional antipsychotic, for its antiviral properties, because it can be taken into the cell and interferes with cell biology in a way that can be virucidal. many antipsychotics and antidepressants were initially invented as antibiotics, and we only discovered their properties in psychiatry over 10 years later. So that is not something that I'd be particularly worried about, the biological effect of these drugs. However, the effect of these drugs on blood pressure control, on lung edema, and on brain function can be quite dangerous, especially one is confused and delirious and gets an high. These drugs can produce a fall in blood pressure. They can reduce the capacity for involuntary movements, so respiration can sometimes be a problem. So managing patients with these confusion states and delirious states with antipsychotics can be a challenge. And that's been the experience in all the ICU experience from our psychiatric colleagues in the West, that administering these drugs for the control of excitement, confusion, delirium is not the same as we would do in people who don't have this COVID infection. So there is a problem there. So people can be very sensitive.
And you mentioned the states, and I was wondering, and I think this again ties into one of the questions we received earlier, if you've noticed any sort of clinical trends in India. I know you mentioned the study on OCD that I thought was again very interesting, but any other clinical trends that you have noticed in the last 2 months?
No, I think those data are still being collected. And like I said, because of this, so there are lots of people who are collecting information, but by the time they are shared in the public domain or talked about, it will be some time. The Indian Journal of Medical Research has put out 2 special issues on COVID, but most of them are to do with the kinds of respiratory syndromes and the genomics and the basic biology of the COVID genome and things like that. So the downstream effects on emotional life and the social connectedness, I think will take a few weeks or months to emerge, especially from the large centers like NIMHANS or AIIMS or PGI, which I know are already doing some of this work. But I think that will emerge in the next few days.
And then we have questions again on specific groups. So a person has asked, what kind of helpful advice can you give the transgender community and women in sex work who are very high risk under these circumstances, especially as the lockdown is lifted?
We do have we in the Indian Psychiatric Society we have a LGB kind of special needs group, but I don't think that the virus itself is the infection itself is socially mediated, but it is. I don't think it is specifically the high-risk profession like sex work or others of that kind would be obviously at higher risk. So there is no way that kind of activity could be without danger. So they would have to, for the time being, look at other ways of handling these kinds of situations, because it is going to be a risk period. And there is no other, as far as the LGBTQ is concerned, I don't think there is anything other than the fact of social isolation, so not physical isolation and distancing, which need to be carried out, which are as applicable to anybody else.
And then I know you talked about sort of the youth already. We also had questions on mental health at this time of the elderly.
Yes.
We have again ideas on possible impact of towards mental health, as well as what can be some strategies that one can use at this time.
I think some of your educational material on your website already refers to that, in care of the elderly and care of the ill at home, because the elderly, like children, their brains need to be constantly stimulated. Understimulation of the brain in the elderly very often slips over into confusion and disorientation. You see that when they have sensory deficits, they are more likely to become paranoid. You know that when the elderly develop any kind of social isolation, or when they lose one sense, like vision or something, they get more prone to hallucinations. So reducing the amount of social day-to-day contact can be very damaging for, obviously, for everybody, but at two ends of the age spectrum, when these things are very dynamic, it produces even greater risk. So again, for the elderly, some degree of social contact and social. You must have read about that lady in Glasgow who was pulled out after 5 days because she had been starving, and she was so afraid to go out that she didn't. She thought if she went out she'd get COVID and have to be hospitalized. So she locked herself in a room and hadn't eaten for 5 days. And somebody had to call the health workers, and they had to take her out. So this kind of isolation can worsen uh, pre-existing fears, and unless there is some degree of equanimity, the elderly can get very disturbed, especially if routine things are not happening around them. So it's a difficult tightrope to walk, but I think that needs to be done. That's all one can say. They are at higher risk. Being socially isolated in a quarantine with no sensory input, no routine social input, can be very damaging for the elderly.
And thank you for mentioning our website. I can also tell our audience that we do have some information and some infographics on some target populations that we think are more at risk. So maybe those resources will be helpful.
NIMHANS has also produced a little manual on mental health aspects of COVID. It's available on the NIMHANS website. It's a brief document of around 40-50 pages, which discusses many of these issues in more detail.
And then some of our questions have to do with sort of, what's next. And one question is asking, how do you predict COVID-19 will shape the future of research in neurological and psychiatric disorders?
Well, I've been trying to convince my colleagues, especially younger colleagues, to actually put in some kind of long-term strategy in place. The impressions that one gained from the previous epidemics of 1918, 50s, and others was that there is a correlation with many what we now call common neurological neuropsychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and dementia, or even multiple sclerosis, the rates of which have increased dramatically over the last 20 years. And autoimmune mechanisms are alleged to be at the bottom of all this increase in autoimmune disorders of the brain, like multiple sclerosis, motor neuron disease, neurodegenerative disorders. What the triggers for that immune response are, we have no idea. Whether they are purely genetic or also environmental, like viremias, like viral infections, is something that we need to fundamentally answer and address. So this, like whatever this slogan you must have come across from by Churchill, never let a crisis go to waste. So this is really what one should plan. We have to enter this kind of research and service needs for the next 40, 50 years. We have to think of this as a time to revamp our entire health system, to integrate service delivery with research. One of the biggest problems have been that the ICMR, which is essentially a research body, has actually no locus standi with the health departments which do the hospital running. So this is time to make sure that research and service are linked, completely intertwined with each other, so that one can do the kind of epidemiological modeling with actual clinical data over the next 10, 20 years. Without that, we'll again be, shooting in the dark and making all kinds of speculative connections. But here we have a chance to actually look at the data and make informed, understanding of how these two illnesses, how various illnesses intersect with each other, including the genetic risk. Now we know that all over the world, people of color have higher death rates in UK or USA, but in India, the death rates are lower. So what has been so different between South Asians in South Asia and South Asians in UK? Was it environmental effects? Was it exposure effects? Was it poorer access to healthcare or social networks? but deaths of South Asians in South Asia are a fraction compared to South Asians in England or America. And we don't know the reason for that. It could be genetic, but it could be a complex gene-environment interface. And unless we participate or we generate that research, we won't be able to answer those questions.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and definitely one that hopefully will be studied and that we'll get more information on. I know I'm aware of the time, so I wanted to request you or ask you if you can go for a little bit longer. I know we have.
Sure.
Okay.
I have my next Zoom only at 7:30, so we have enough time.
I think maybe another 10-15 minutes.
But I wouldn't like to extend the patience of the audience either.
No, I'm sure our audience is thrilled actually to be talking to somebody who is talking about research and service, and how you're bringing both of these domains in here in the way that you've been suggesting. Somebody's also asked how might living through this pandemic sort of shape society, in terms of, does one become more closed, paranoid, or does it actually lead to more empathy in terms of its citizens? And just your thoughts on that.
See, that's one of the article which which is about to come out in a few days actually makes this link between the othering of the virus. Now, for many years now, we've been mixing up medicine, politics, and we hunt for terrorists, and we sanitize the zones around terrorism, and we sanitize the zones around a virus. So we are using sanitization both in a political construct and as a medical construct. So obviously, in our minds, the two things are linked to each other. We view violence and infection with the same degree of danger and as the fault of the other, always the other. It is not something we, at least in much of our public domain, in India at least, the virus is always being brought by somebody else. It came in with somebody else, it is being brought in by trains, it is being brought in by somebody. The fact that it is a normal mutation in a normal virus, which occurs, mutations occur all the time, it's a part of evolution, is hardly being told to anybody. It is always somebody else's fault. And this othering of the vague unknown other is a kind of a paranoid position. It gives rise to a suspicion of everybody. A virus is not mutating to personally kill you as a person. It is just a part of biology. It is just an inconsequential RNA random event which happens stochastically, has been happening stochastically, which is why we are what we are. To assume that we are somehow unique and everybody else is a threat to us is an illogical scientific illusion. So this is the kind of common sense science which is absent. We are tracking people as if the people themselves are the problem. Every day, the train loads which arrive from Maharashtra are 25% affected, 75% affected, as if the whole of Bombay is out to kill somebody in Calcutta. Now that is not an appropriate social psychological response. And this kind of othering will create problems. And that is really a concern, that this kind of paranoia about everybody else and everything else is going to create a closed mind, and that is very dangerous.
So what you're saying actually is that we really need to watch the language and the stigma around it, sort of, and perhaps by doing that, then it might allow us to actually feel more empathy towards other change.
Yeah. I mean, this whole thing of viewing it in almost mythological terms, the Mahamari or whatever they call it, which is the old, it was almost like a goddess term, at least in South India. Mariamma and Mahamaris were semi-malevolent but supernatural beings. It is not a supernatural being, it's just a little 30,000 base pairs of same old GCAT that all of us are made of. It's completely straightforward. So there's no reason to have this kind of catastrophic kind of response to it.
And then then I know people have asked if there are foods and drinks that can have any positive effects on psychosomatic behaviors as well as yoga as a coping mechanism for stress. Anything on these domains that you can comment on?
Well, those are not, I don't think there's anything specific that we know about all this. There is, of course, one could call it Ayurveda or whichever aspect of medicine, but most societies know of foods which have some kind of antiseptic quality. Ginger, turmeric, cloves, various kinds of, sunflower oil, mustard oil, all of them, coconut oil, all of them are known to have certain kinds of antiseptic properties for as long as human beings exist. All folk medicines have it. So the fact that certain diets or certain ways of living could give rise to a cleaner lifestyle or a less infection-prone lifestyle is known forever, which is why the whole social behavior of washing hands and utensils and all that persists. Beyond that, I don't think we know of any specific food or any specific exercise that we think can impact the responses to COVID. Like with everything else, people who have had previous history of good cardiorespiratory reserve, which means non-smokers, although there is some evidence that smokers could be protected against, but many others feel that having a good cardiorespiratory reserve, good lung function in advance, which basically means regular exercise, which could be yoga, etc., could protect. But I don't think any of these are effective in the acute term as prophylaxis against the infection.
And then maybe I will start wrapping up. I know that people will still have questions, but maybe I'll ask you one last question that I think actually ties into the previous question that you had talked about. This is related to the taboo about or towards discussing diseases of the mind. Someone has asked, that this is documented in your book, comparing then and now. Do you see a difference? And then in your experience, why are conversations related to mental health and therefore mental illness so difficult to have? Why do people go to such great lengths to avoid such conversations? What can we do to change that?
I think you could answer that question equally well. So.
No, but I'm actually curious to hear your perspective because you brought in some for me to think about too. Yeah.
Well, see, the mind is the essential unknown. When I finished medicine long time ago, 1980, a book came out on the Encyclopedia of Medical Ignorance, which highlighted all the things in medicine that we were completely unaware about. And part of the book was things that we knew we would answer somewhere or the other, like cancer. So they knew, even in 1980, that understanding the basic process of cancer was a technology away. It was just a question of understanding pathology, genetics, or some kind of mutagenesis slightly better, and you would understand how cancers arose. But by far the biggest part of that encyclopedia was psychiatry, because we really have no models to understand how this arises. It remains the essential unknown of the whole of medicine. It is the youngest science in medicine. We have very little understanding why this occurs. The human soul has been a source of mystery to philosophers, religious people, society at large, and to scientists. So therefore, the fear of the unknown is, I think, the fear of talking about mental health. You really don't know what you mean by it. You really don't know how your own mind works. You have very little idea how thoughts come into your mind, how you do the things you do, why you have done the things you do. And therefore the understanding of what happens to other people who lose their mind, how is it that they have lost their mind, is a completely incomprehensible experience for the patient, often for the doctor, and very much so for the society at large. We have no reason. We don't have anything simple like a COVID-19 30,000 base pairs causes schizophrenia. So it really is unknown, and therefore people feel very, very hesitant, or because it is an existential doubt in everybody's mind, the psychiatrist and the patient. And so I think that is the fundamental reason why mental health problems are so difficult to talk about, because we are using metaphors, meanings, and social constructs to explain something that could be arising from molecular events or from political events. No other branch of medicine works at that width of exposure. So it really is a bit of a challenge to really inverted commas understand psychological problems, and therefore people feel hesitant, and doctors feel always under-equipped and hesitant to talk about it too much. So that is a real problem with the field, as you would know, as being a psychologist.
Right. But I think it's also interesting how you are drawing certain parallels with mental illness, mental health, with the outbreak currently, just in terms of, what not knowing and how the fear of the unknown can have an effect on so many different domains. Any suggestions on what can be done, at least in the context of mental health and talking about it, to address some of the points that you've mentioned here?
I'm a firm believer in the fact that just knowledge sets the mind free. So I think your efforts to improve the actual scientific understanding of this whole thing and the permeation of that into all levels of society is actually the most effective way. Because I think unless people really understand in their, almost in their guts, what is it that they are dealing with, prescriptive, that is the only way to deal with it. Whatever people do, we would have to leave it to their understanding of what the illness is. And if their understanding is based on actual information, then you can expect that people will make a rational decision. So the only way to handle this is to make sure that accurate, unbiased information is shared with all people, as many people, because we expect that people in general are rational, reasonable people who will work and behave in reasonable, rational ways. Unless you drive them into irrational behaviors by this kind of forced migrations and evictions and violence.
I think that's such a good sort of space to maybe end our session today. I want to thank you. I know I've walked away with sort of several takeaways. I enjoyed how you began with talking about the biological roots and then moved to the social kind of implications. You addressed current impact, and also helped us understand what things might look like in the future. I'm sure from what we can gather from the comments too, people have found many valuable takeaways.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for our audience, I just have a few announcements before we sort of sign off for today. So the next web event by ISRC is going to be in Marathi, where ISRC scientists will answer audience questions on COVID-19 based on, again, scientific evidence. This is on Tuesday, June 2nd, 6 p.m. Registration is ongoing. Marathi speakers can send in their questions during registration. And you can also share this information with Marathi speakers that you might know. Next Sunday's webinar is by Janvi Phalke from ICTS Bangalore. She's visiting faculty at NIAS and founding director of the Science Gallery in Bangalore. She is a science historian and will speak on public understanding of science and public engagement with science, topics again that we believe are extremely relevant in these times. This will have something for everyone, scientists and science enthusiasts. Do join us then. So same time next Sunday. Registration will be announced through our website and social media channels. Thank you again so much, Dr. Jain. Thank you to our audience for your questions and comments. Thank you to everyone.